All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into something that I think we can all agree is a little bit of a mystery sometimes. It's cultural differences. And we're not talking about like, just surface level stereotypes. No, no, no. We want to actually understand how to work effectively with people from all over the world,
Yeah.
especially because you're getting ready to work with a global team. It's like, you've been handed this amazing opportunity. But also, it's like this puzzle box of how to actually make it work. You know what I mean?
The stakes are super high. It's not just like, avoiding those awkward moments in a meeting or something. It's about whether projects actually succeed or fail, right? Whether you
Right.
can build trust or if everything just falls apart. And that's why today we are going to use Erin Meyer's Culture Map. It's a book, and think of it as like a GPS for navigating these tricky waters of how different cultures actually operate.
So it's not like, we're going to sit here and try to memorize a million do's and don'ts or like all these
Yeah.
cultural rules for every single country. I mean, who has time for that?
Nobody. It's so much deeper than that. It's about understanding the underlying, operating system that makes someone, say, from Japan, approach a meeting so differently from someone from Brazil, you know?
Totally. Like what makes people tick differently in different parts of the world?
Exactly. Meyer uses this great story about a consultant. His name was Bo, and he was from China. And in meetings, he would just be totally silent, like he wouldn't say a word.
Mhm.
And so, of course, everyone thought he was totally unprepared.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But it turns out that in Chinese culture, it can actually be disrespectful to jump in before someone who's more senior has had their say, or to openly disagree with someone in a meeting. Sabo was actually showing respect by being quiet, but everyone in the room completely misread the situation.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That is so interesting. I mean, I've definitely been in situations where I've probably totally misinterpreted things like that, you
Yeah.
know? So how do we actually avoid that, you know?
Yeah.
How do we get it right?
Well, that's where the culture map comes in. Meyer gives us these 8 cultural scales, and it's like a map, right? And each scale shows where different cultures fall on a spectrum.
Okay, so it's not about putting people in boxes. It's about kind of getting this additional layer of understanding.
Exactly. It's like having an extra set of glasses that lets you see the grain through a different lens.
I like that. So give us a sneak peek. What are these scales all about? What kind of map are we talking about here?
Okay, so you've got a scale for communicating, and this one looks at how direct or indirect a culture is. Then there's valuating, which is like how directly people give feedback. Some cultures are brutally honest, while others are, much more subtle.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Okay, what else?
Then you've got leading. This one looks at whether a culture prefers an egalitarian leadership style or a more hierarchical one. And then there's deciding, which contrasts consensual decision-making versus top-down decision-making.
Yeah, I can see how that one could cause some real fireworks in a team.
Big time. Okay, so that's 4. Ready for the next 4?
Hit me.
We've got trusting. This one looks at task-based versus relationship-based cultures, Some folks are like, let's just get down to business, and others need to, have that personal connection first. And then there's disagreeing, which is how comfortable a culture is with, open confrontation.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, last 2.
We have scheduling. This
Mhm.
is all about linear time versus flexible time, strict schedules versus going with the flow. And finally, there's persuading, which looks at how people build their arguments. Some cultures start with big picture principles, while others focus on practical applications first.
Okay, my brain is officially in overdrive. So we've got our map, we've got our scales. Where do we start applying all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with communicating, right? Because it
Yeah.
underpins everything. I mean, think about it. Have you ever, asked someone for directions and their response was super vague, even though you were totally clear about what you wanted to know?
Oh my gosh, yes. I remember trying to find this specific shop in a market in Marrakech, and people kept pointing me in all these random directions. I was so lost. I was so frustrated at the time. But now I'm wondering if it was a cultural miscommunication thing.
It probably was. It all comes down to how much information a culture conveys explicitly versus implicitly. The US is super explicit. We spell things out, we're direct, we have, those super long contracts with all the details. But in many other cultures, a lot is conveyed through shared understanding and subtle cues. It's all about reading between the lines.
So if you're from a very direct culture and you're working with someone from more indirect culture,
Yeah.
you might feel like they're being vague or evasive.
Yeah.
But they might think you're being rude or aggressive.
Exactly. It's not about right or wrong. It's about different cultural norms.
Okay, so in a culture where a lot is unsaid, It's not just what you say, but how you say it and even what you don't say,
Mm.
right?
100%. And this can lead to so many misunderstandings. Imagine, like, you're an American manager working with a Japanese team, right? You want everything in writing, clear deadlines, everything spelled out. But your Japanese colleagues might be more comfortable with a more flexible approach where you, like, work out the details as you go along.
Oh, wow. So how do you even make that work? Do things just fall apart?
They can, unless both sides are, like, aware of these differences and make an effort to bridge the gap. And that's where the culture map is so helpful. It helps us to understand these different perspectives and find a way to work together effectively.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've just dipped our toes into communicating, and it's already so fascinating. What's next on our cultural GPS?
Let's move on to something that can be even trickier. How cultures give and receive feedback. This is the evaluating scale.
Oh, feedback.
Yeah.
Everyone's favorite topic. All right, let's hear it. Where do we even begin with this one?
Okay, imagine this. You're working on a project, you get your performance review, and your boss is praising you. But then later your colleagues are like, you're in big trouble, man. Like, that is cultural miscommunication at its finest.
Wait, seriously? How does that even happen?
Cultures differ a lot in how directly they give negative feedback. Some cultures, like in the Netherlands, they're known for being super direct. They'll tell you exactly what they think, no sugarcoating. But others, like the US, tend to be more indirect, right? We like to sandwich the criticism between positive comments to kind of soften the blow.
Oh, yeah, the compliment sandwich.
Yeah.
I know that one all too well. But how does that go over in other cultures?
That's the thing, it often doesn't. To someone from a more direct culture, that sandwich approach can seem insincere or even confusing. They're like, what are you really trying to say? And
Yeah.
someone from a more indirect culture might just be completely blindsided by blunt feedback and feel really attacked.
Wow. I am totally rethinking some past experiences where I just thought someone was being mean, but maybe it was just a cultural thing.
It's very possible. So it's about awareness. Recognizing that what's normal for you might not be normal for someone else.
Right. But how do you figure out what is normal in a different culture? Do you, like, straight up ask, hey, so how do you guys do feedback around here?
Well, you can be that direct, but honestly, it's often more subtle. You can observe how your colleagues interact, like how do they respond to feedback? How do they give feedback? You can also, read up on the specific cultures you're working with. Are they known for being direct or indirect? Once you get a sense of the norms, you can start adapting.
So if I'm working with a Dutch team, I should probably just brace myself for some brutal honesty.
You might. But remember, it's not meant to be mean. It's just their way of being clear and efficient. And, if you're working with a Japanese team, you might need to be a lot more subtle. Focus on the positive and gently suggest areas for improvement.
This is so interesting. It's like learning a whole new language, but for feedback.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered communicating and evaluating. What's next?
Let's talk leadership. This
Yeah.
is the leading scale, and it gets into a big one. How cultures view power. The power distance between bosses and employees.
Ooh, power dynamics.
Yeah.
That is something I've definitely struggled with. Like, how much authority do I exert as a leader, right?
Yeah.
How do you balance being respectful of everyone's culture while also getting things done? It can feel like walking a tightrope sometimes. So fill us in. What are the big differences we need to be aware of here?
You hit the nail on the head. It is a balancing act. Like some cultures, they have a very low power distance. Think about Denmark, for example. Bosses are seen more as facilitators, or coaches, and employees are expected to take initiative and make decisions on their own. But in other cultures, there's a much higher power distance. Think about China. Bosses are seen as authority figures who, make decisions. Employees follow their instructions.
Okay, so like different levels of hierarchy. But how does this play out in a real situation? Give us an example.
Imagine you're an American manager and you're working in Japan. You pride yourself on being like really approachable, collaborative. You want your team to, share ideas and challenge your decisions. But you notice that your team is super hesitant to speak up and they seem uncomfortable with your style.
I can see how that would be confusing and frustrating.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Well, in Japanese culture, showing respect for seniority and authority is super important. So your team might see your casual approach as like a lack of leadership or even disrespectful. They might be waiting for you to provide more direction and make those final decisions.
So what's the answer? Does that manager have to completely change their style and become super strict, like super authoritarian?
Not necessarily. It's about finding that middle ground. You can still be collaborative and encourage your team to contribute, but you also have to be mindful of the cultural norms around hierarchy. Like you might need to be a little more formal in your communication, and you might need to be more explicit about your decision-making process.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. It's not about completely changing who you are, but it's about adapting to the cultural context. What other tips do you have for dealing with these power dynamics?
One of the big challenges is communication, right? How do you communicate effectively across those cultural divides? Like in low power distance cultures, communication tends to be very informal and direct. People are comfortable challenging their boss, they share their opinions openly.
Yeah, like in those American workplace sitcoms where everyone's always like cracking jokes with the CEO and stuff.
Exactly. But in high power distance cultures, communication is much more formal and often indirect. People are much more careful about how they address their superiors, and they might be a lot more hesitant to disagree openly.
So like if you're used to that very direct, casual American style, you might need to tone it down a bit when you're working with a team from a high power distance culture.
Exactly. And if you're from a high power distance culture and you're working in the US, you might need to get used to that more informal style and be prepared to speak up more directly.
This is great. It's really making me think about how I communicate and lead. Okay, so we've tackled communicating, evaluating, and leading. What's next?
Let's talk about something that can cause a lot of frustration, especially in multicultural teams. It's decision making. This is the deciding scale, and it looks at consensual versus top down decision making styles.
Ooh, decision making. Big one. I've definitely been in those meetings that felt like they were going around in circles forever, like trying to reach a decision that seemed totally obvious to me. So break it down for us. What are the key differences here, and how do we avoid those frustrating situations?
It's all about understanding the cultural norms. Some cultures, like Japan, Germany, they tend to be very consensual. Everyone has to be consulted. The goal is to reach a decision that everyone supports, even if it takes longer.
Okay, so it's about building consensus, making sure everyone feels heard and included.
Exactly. But in other cultures, think like the US, decisions are made more quickly and decisively, often by the leader, even if not everyone completely agrees.
Right. So you can see how those two approaches could really clash. Like imagine an American manager trying to push for a quick decision, but their Japanese team wants to keep discussing and discussing.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to be aware of these differences and adjust your expectations. If you're from a culture that values quick decisions, be patient with your colleagues from more consensual cultures. Take the time to explain your reasoning, get everyone on board. And if you're from a more consensual culture, you might need to be a little more assertive and voice your opinions, even if it feels uncomfortable at first.
So it's all about finding that balance, efficiency, but also inclusivity. I'm curious though, are there any cultures that are like somewhere in the middle of the spectrum? Not completely consensual, but not completely top down.
Totally. It's not black and white. Many cultures blend these styles. Like in France, decisions are often made by a smaller group, but there's still a big emphasis on consensus within that group.
This is really making me rethink how I approach decisions. Okay, we've covered communicating, evaluating, leading, and deciding. What's next on our cultural journey?
Let's talk about one of the most fundamental parts of human interaction. It's trust. And this is the trusting scale. We're going to explore the ways different cultures build trust and show trust.
Oh, trust, that elusive thing that's so essential for relationships.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling this is where things get even more complicated when you throw in different cultures. So what do we need to know about trust across cultures?
You're right, it gets tricky fast. Here's the big thing. Some cultures build trust through tasks, while others build it through relationships. In task-based cultures, think the US or Germany, trust is about competence and reliability. You show up on time, you do what you say you're going to do, you get the job done, and that builds trust.
Okay, so it's like you deliver, I trust you.
Exactly. But in relationship-based cultures, think China or Brazil, trust is built through personal connections. You spend time getting to know each other, you share meals, you tell stories, and that shared experience creates a bond of trust.
So it's not just about what you do, it's who you are and how well you connect with people on a personal level. I can see how this could lead to misunderstandings.
For sure. Imagine an American business person trying to close a deal with a Chinese company. They've done all their research, got their killer presentation ready to get down to business. But their Chinese counterparts are more interested in getting to know them personally, taking them out to dinner, asking about their family. And they might even seem hesitant to talk business at all until they feel like they've built that personal connection.
Oh, wow. That would be so frustrating. You'd probably be thinking, just sign the contract already.
Yeah.
But to them, it's not about rushing. It's about building that foundation of trust.
Exactly. And this can be really hard for people from task-based cultures, right? They might see all that socializing as a waste of time or even manipulation. But for people from relationship-based cultures, it's just how you do business.
So how do we navigate this trust gap? Do we have to, like, completely change who we are to fit in?
Not at all. It's about awareness. If you're from a task-based culture, be prepared to invest some time in building relationships. Be patient, be curious, be willing to share a bit about yourself. And if you're from a relationship-based culture, understand that your task-based counterparts might not be as comfortable with all the personal stuff right away.
This is so insightful. I'm realizing that trust isn't just one thing. It's this whole spectrum of behaviors and expectations that can be totally different across cultures.
Exactly.
Okay, we've tackled communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, and trusting. What's next?
Let's talk about something that can be a bit of a minefield, especially in multicultural teams. It's disagreement. This is the disagreeing scale, and it explores how comfortable different cultures are with open confrontation.
Oh, disagreement. Yeah, this is a big one. I've definitely had some cross-cultural mishaps in this area. Like, how do you know when it's okay to push back and when you should just kind of go with the flow? It could be so confusing. So what do we need to know about disagreeing across cultures?
It's all about understanding the cultural norms, right? Some cultures are super comfortable with open disagreement. Think France, Israel. They see debate as a sign of engagement. They love to challenge each other's ideas, even if it gets a little heated.
Oh, wow. So like a lively debate is a good thing.
Totally. But in other cultures, think Japan or Korea, open disagreement is seen as disrespectful and disruptive. It's all about maintaining harmony and avoiding confrontation, even if it means keeping your opinions to yourself.
Wow, that's such a contrast. I can imagine those two approaches clashing big time. Like, if you have a French manager passionately arguing with a Japanese colleague, it would be so awkward.
You're telling me. The French manager might see the Japanese colleague's silence as, like, disinterest or even disrespect, right? But the Japanese colleague might be deeply offended by the directness. They might see it as a personal attack.
So how do we avoid that? How do we navigate these differences?
It starts with awareness. Recognizing that your own comfort level with disagreement might be totally different from someone else's. If you're from a more confrontational culture, you got to be mindful of how your directness might be perceived, right? You might need to soften your language a bit, be more diplomatic. And if you're from a culture that avoids confrontation, you might need to be more assertive about expressing your opinions. Make sure your voice is heard, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
But what about situations where you really need to disagree with someone, even if they're from a culture that avoids confrontation? How do you handle that?
That's a tough one, right? There are a few strategies you can try. First, focus on the issue, not the person. Stick to the facts. Avoid making it personal. Second, use I statements to express your own perspective without, attacking. So instead of saying, you're wrong about this, you could say, I see things a little differently. And third, be respectful of the other person's culture. If they seem uncomfortable with the confrontation, try to find a more indirect way to express your disagreement.
Those are great tips. So disagreeing effectively across cultures is about balancing being assertive, but also being sensitive.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance, but it's one we all need to learn how to do in today's globalized world.
Okay, we've covered communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, and disagreeing. What's next?
Let's talk about something that can be a major source of stress, especially when working across time zones: scheduling. This is the scheduling scale, and it looks at how different cultures perceive and manage time.
Ooh, scheduling. This is a big one for me. I've definitely had my share of scheduling snafus. Like, what does it even mean to be on time in different cultures? And how do you avoid those awkward moments where, like, you show up for a meeting and you're either the only one there or everyone else has been waiting for an hour?
It's a common point of confusion. Cultures can be drastically different in how they view time, and this can really affect how people work together. Some cultures, like Germany, Switzerland, they have a very linear view of time. Punctuality is super important. They stick to schedules. They see time as like a finite resource that you don't waste.
Right. Like time is money. But I'm guessing that's not the case everywhere.
Exactly. In a lot of cultures, especially those where relationships are super important, time is much more fluid and flexible. Interruptions are expected, delays are no big deal, and relationships are more important than sticking to a rigid schedule.
Okay, so how does this play out in real life? Give us an example.
Imagine you're an American executive and you're trying to schedule a meeting with a team in Brazil. You send out a calendar invite for 10:00 a.m. sharp. You arrive at 9:55, ready to get down to business.
Okay, sounds normal so far. What happens next?
Well, your Brazilian colleagues might not arrive until 10:30 or even later, and they might not even apologize for the delay. They'll just stroll in, greet everyone warmly, maybe chat about their weekend, and then get started.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would be a little jarring if you're used to that very strict American sense of time.
Totally. But it's important to remember that they're not trying to be disrespectful. They're just operating on a different cultural clock. In Brazilian culture, relationships are often seen as more important than rigid schedules. A bit of flexibility is just expected.
So how do you manage that? Do you just have to accept that meetings will always start late?
Not necessarily. You can set clear expectations, but also be flexible. If you're from a linear time culture, you might need to be more upfront about your expectations around punctuality. And be patient with your colleagues from more flexible cultures.
Okay, so finding that balance between structure and flexibility. I'm curious, though, are there any cultures that are, like, in the middle of the spectrum? Not totally linear, not totally flexible.
Of course, there are always shades of gray. Many cultures blend those approaches. Like in France, people generally value being on time, but they're also more likely to be okay with interruptions or delays, especially if it's about building relationships.
Okay, this is making me rethink my whole relationship with my calendar. Maybe I need to loosen up a bit.
Maybe so. It's good to be aware of our own biases and adapt to different norms.
All right, we've revisited communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. What's our final stop on our cultural world tour today?
Let's talk about one of the most important parts of business and communication in general, persuasion. This is the persuading scale, and it looks at how different cultures build and present their arguments.
Ooh, persuasion. This is something I'm really interested in because it's not just about having a good argument, right? It's about connecting with your audience, understanding their values, and tailoring your message to them. And I'm guessing it gets even more complex when you're talking about different cultures.
Absolutely. Persuasion is much more nuanced than we often realize. And remember the difference between application first and principle first arguments.
Right. Application-first cultures, like the U.S., start with specific examples and then build up to the main point. While principle-first cultures, like France, start with the big picture and then give the evidence. Right.
You got it. But how does this actually play out in real life?
Yeah, give us an example.
Okay, imagine you're an American executive trying to sell a new software product to a German client. You come in all enthusiastic, showcasing all the cool features, talking about efficiency and ease of use.
Sounds like a pretty standard sales pitch. What's the problem?
Well, your German client might not be that impressed. They might be thinking, where's the data? Where's the proof that this actually works? How does this fit with our existing systems? They need that concrete evidence to be convinced.
Oh, wow. So you might think you're giving this amazing presentation, but they're just not buying it because you haven't given them the kind of information they need.
Exactly. And it's not that they're trying to be difficult. They're just coming at it from a different cultural perspective. In German culture, there's a huge emphasis on thoroughness and detail. They need to see the evidence to feel confident about making a decision.
So do you just, like, drown them in data and statistics then?
Not necessarily. It's about finding a balance. You need to show the benefits, but also provide the proof that your German client needs. So you might adjust your presentation, maybe focus more on technical details, provide case studies, testimonials from other clients, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's about adapting your message to the cultural context. It's like the culture map really is a secret weapon for understanding how people think and make decisions.
I like to think so. It's about building those bridges of understanding, even when we have different approaches to getting things done.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we've gone through all 8 of those cultural scales. My brain is officially full, but in a good way. I feel like I've been given this incredible toolkit for understanding and navigating cultural differences.
That's great. I think the most important thing to remember is that culture matters. It shapes how we think, how we talk to each other, how we build relationships. And the more aware we are of these differences, the better we can communicate, the more empathetic we can be as leaders, and the more successful we can be in a global world.
I love that. So to our listeners, take a minute and think about what we've talked about today. Think about your own cultural background. How might that be influencing your interactions? And be curious, right? The world is full of these amazing cultural differences, and the more we learn, the better. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into the culture map, and we'll explore some more real-world examples of how these scales play out. Stay tuned. Welcome back, deep divers. I am still processing all those cultural scales we talked about in part 1. It's amazing how something so invisible can have such a big impact.
Right. It's like you suddenly see the matrix, you become aware of these differences, and you start noticing them everywhere. It can really change how you interpret things that maybe were confusing before.
Totally. Okay, so we've got our culture map right.
Huh.
But how do we actually use this thing in the real world?
Well, let's go back to the communicating scale because it affects almost every single interaction we have, right? Whether we realize it or not. Think about it. Have you ever felt like someone was being vague or indirect and it just drove you crazy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember working with this colleague from Japan, and I would send these like super detailed emails, outlining every step of the project. And I would hardly ever get a straight answer. It was always, we'll consider it carefully or we'll discuss it as a team. And it just like drove me nuts.
And I bet your colleague was probably just as confused by your approach. They might have seen all those details as like overly assertive or even distrustful, like you didn't trust them to handle the project.
Yeah.
In Japanese culture, harmony and indirect communication are super important. So they might have been more comfortable with a more like subtle collaborative approach.
So it was like we were speaking the same language, but with totally different dictionaries.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why the culture map can be so helpful. It helps us to decode those dictionaries, and see things from a different perspective.
Okay, so let's say I'm about to start working with a team from a culture that's very different from my own.
Mm.
Where do I even begin? Do I just like Google cultural etiquette tips for insert country here?
Well, you can start there, but cultures are complicated, right? There's no one-size-fits-all answer. The culture map is more like a framework, not a rule book. The key is to be curious and observant. Pay attention to how your colleagues communicate, how they make decisions, how they build relationships. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
So instead of assuming everyone operates the same way I do, I should be asking things like, how do you prefer to receive feedback? Or what's the typical decision-making process on your team?
That's exactly right. Those questions show respect and that you're willing to learn, which can go a long way in building trust and avoiding those misunderstandings.
This is making me think about the evaluating scale again, how directly cultures give feedback. I'm realizing I've probably made some, like, major mistakes in the past without even knowing it.
Oh, we all have. It's a common blind spot. Remember that story from the book about the Dutch manager who publicly criticized a colleague, and the colleague actually thanked him for being honest?
Yeah, that's a classic example of how cultural norms around feedback can clash, right?
Totally. And it can be tricky for managers. Let's say you're an American manager, and you're used to giving feedback the sandwich way.
Mm-hmm.
A little praise, then the criticism, then more praise.
Oh, the compliment sandwich, I've gotten those. But yeah, honestly, I always feel kind of patronized, like just get to the point.
Right. And to someone from a more direct culture, the sandwich can seem like insincere or confusing. They're left wondering what you really mean.
So what's the solution? Do we just, like, ditch the sandwich altogether and go for full-on brutal honesty?
Well, not necessarily. It's about adapting to the context,
Yeah.
right? If you're working with a team from a more direct culture, you can probably be more straightforward. But if it's a more indirect culture, you might need to be more subtle.
Okay, so it's all about reading the room. Right. Understanding those cultural norms and adapting your approach. It's feeling less like a minefield and more like, a puzzle that you can actually solve.
That's a great way to think about it. It's about embracing those differences and seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow.
All right, so we revisited communicating and evaluating. What's next?
Let's talk leadership again. Remember the leading scale. It's all about power distance between bosses and employees.
Oh, yes. Power dynamics. This is something I'm always super aware of, especially when I'm working with teams from different cultures. I never want to come across as too bossy or overbearing, but I also want to be an effective leader.
It's a tough balance, and it can be especially hard for leaders who are used to a more like egalitarian style. Like a lot of American managers, they might be used to working really collaboratively, encouraging open communication, sharing decision-making power.
Yeah, like my door's always open, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But that approach doesn't always translate well across cultures. In many cultures, especially those with a higher power distance, leaders are expected to be more directive and authoritative. They're the decision makers, and employees are expected to follow their lead.
So how does that actually look in a real situation? Give us an example.
Okay, so imagine you're an American manager and you're leading a team in China. You like to have brainstorming sessions where everyone throws out ideas and you make decisions based on consensus. But you notice your Chinese team is really hesitant to speak up, and they seem to be deferring to you for all the decisions.
Oh, I can see how that would be frustrating. You'd probably be thinking, why aren't they contributing? Do they even care?
Right. But it might not be about lack of interest or engagement at all. It could be their cultural norms around leadership and hierarchy. In Chinese culture, it can be really disrespectful to openly challenge your boss or disagree with their ideas, especially in front of others.
Wow. So what's the answer? Does that manager have to just become a super strict authoritarian boss?
Not at all. It's about finding that balance again, right? You can still encourage their input and create a collaborative environment, but you might need to be more explicit about your role as the decision maker, and maybe more mindful of how you communicate your expectations and feedback.
Okay, so you adapt your leadership style to fit the culture,
Hmm.
but without, like, abandoning your core values. I'm really seeing how powerful this culture map can be. It's like a decoder ring for understanding how people operate.
I love that analogy. It's like having a key to unlock a whole new level of understanding and connection.
All right, we've revisited communicating, evaluating, and leading. What's next?
Let's go back to decision making. Remember the deciding scale? It looks at those different styles, consensual versus top down.
Oh yeah, decision making. This is one where I've definitely learned some hard lessons in my cross-cultural experiences.
Yeah.
I used to think there was like one right way to make decisions, but it's so much more nuanced than that.
You're so right. There's no one right way. What works in one culture might totally backfire in another. That's where the culture map is so helpful. It helps us to understand the norms in different cultures and how to adapt our approach.
Okay, so remind us again, what are the key differences between those two styles? Consensual versus top-down.
In consensual cultures, like in Japan or Germany, decisions are usually made through a very collaborative process. Everyone who will be affected by the decision is involved. The goal is to get everyone to agree, even if it takes longer.
Okay, so it's about inclusivity and making sure everyone has a voice. I can see how that's valuable, especially for big decisions that are going to have a major impact.
Right. But in top-down cultures, like the US or the UK, decisions are made much more quickly, often by the leader or a small group of people. The focus is on efficiency and getting things done.
Okay, so it's a trade-off. Consensual cultures value inclusivity, taking the time to get it right. Top-down cultures are all about speed and being decisive.
Exactly. And you can imagine how this can cause friction when you have a team with people from both kinds of cultures. Like, imagine an American manager, they're used to making decisions quickly and moving on, but their Japanese team wants to keep discussing and discussing before they make a decision.
Oh yeah, I've been in those meetings. It's like, can we just make a decision already?
I know, right? But it's important to remember that they're not trying to be difficult. They're following their cultural norms.
So how do you navigate that? Do you just have to, like, give in and go with the slower pace?
Not necessarily. It's about finding that balance, right? You can encourage them to be more decisive, but also be respectful of their need for consensus.
So meeting somewhere in the middle. Are there cultures that are kind of in the middle too? Like not totally consensual, but not completely top down?
Absolutely. It's never black and white, right?
Yeah.
Lots of cultures blend the styles. Like in France, decisions are often made by a smaller group, but they still put a big emphasis on building consensus within that group.
Okay, this is making me think about how I make decisions in general. Maybe I need to be more mindful of different cultural perspectives and, be more inclusive in my process.
That's a great insight. We all have our biases. It's about being aware of those and adapting to the context.
Right. We revisited communicating, evaluating, leading, and deciding. What's next?
Let's talk about trust again. It's the basis for any successful relationship, right? Personal or professional.
Ah, trust. So important, but I bet it gets even more complicated across cultures. So, what do we need to remember about building trust with people from different backgrounds?
Remember the trusting scale. It's all about how cultures build trust. Through tasks or through relationships.
Right. Task-based trust, it's about proving yourself through your actions. Relationship-based trust, it's more about that personal connection. But how do those approaches actually play out, in real life? Give us an example.
Let's say you're an American business person and you're trying to close a deal with a Brazilian company, right? You've done your research, you have your presentation, you're ready to talk business. You come in all sharp and focused, ready to make your pitch.
Okay, sounds pretty standard. What's the problem?
Well, your Brazilian counterparts might not be ready to jump into business just yet. They might want to spend time getting to know you, sharing a meal, talking about family, building that personal connection. Then they'll talk about the deal.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would be frustrating if you're thinking, come on, let's get this done.
I know. But to them, it's not about rushing. It's about establishing trust, building a relationship. In Brazilian culture, relationships are often more important than tasks. That personal connection is how they do business.
So how do you deal with that? Do you have to force yourself to be super social, even if you're not? Pretend to be interested in things you're not?
No way. It's about being genuine and respecting their norms. If you're from a task-based culture, be prepared to invest time in building those relationships. Be patient, be curious, share a bit about yourself. And if you're from a relationship-based culture, understand that your counterparts might not be as comfortable with all the personal stuff right away.
So it's about that balance again, right? Being yourself, but also adapting to the context. It's making a lot of sense now.
It's all about building those bridges, finding common ground.
All right, we revisited communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, and trusting. What's next?
Let's talk about disagreement again. Remember that disagreeing scale. How comfortable are different cultures with confrontation?
Oh, disagreement. This is one I'm always a little nervous about, especially with people from different cultures. I don't want to be rude, but I also don't want to be a pushover.
It's a tough one. That's where those cultural differences can really show up. Some cultures are pretty comfortable with open disagreement. The US, the UK. You're supposed to speak your mind. Debate is a good thing, right? It's how you come up with the best solution.
Right, like iron sharpens iron, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But in a lot of cultures, especially those that value harmony and respect for authority, open disagreement is seen as disrespectful, disruptive. People might express their opinions indirectly or avoid confrontation altogether.
So different approaches. How does this play out in the real world? Another example.
Okay, so imagine you're an American manager and you're leading a team in Japan. You're in a meeting talking about a new project and you're encouraging everyone to brainstorm and share ideas. But you notice one of your Japanese team members is hesitant to speak up. They seem to have some reservations about the project, but they're not saying anything.
Ooh, that would be frustrating. You'd be like, why aren't they saying anything? Do they not care?
Exactly. But it might not be about lack of interest at all. It could be those cultural norms around disagreement and hierarchy. In Japan, it can be very disrespectful to openly disagree with your boss or contradict them, especially in front of other people.
So what can you do? Does that mean you'll never get honest feedback from them?
Not at all. It's about creating a safe space for them to share their opinions, even if they disagree. You might need to be more patient, more encouraging, maybe find ways to get feedback more indirectly.
So reading the cues, understanding the norms, and adapting your style. I'm realizing I need to think about how my directness might come across, maybe be more diplomatic.
That's a great point. It's about building those bridges, even when we don't agree.
Okay, we revisited communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, and trusting, and disagreeing. What's next?
Let's talk about scheduling again. Remember, that can be a real source of stress when working across cultures. The scheduling scale, different ways people think about time.
Oh, scheduling. I've definitely messed this up before. What does on time even mean in different cultures? How do you avoid those awkward moments when you're the only one there? Or everyone else has been waiting forever?
I know, it's so confusing. Cultures have such different ideas about time, and it can really affect teamwork. Some cultures, like Germany or Switzerland, they're very linear time-focused. Punctuality matters. They stick to schedules. Time is precious.
Yeah, it's like time is money. But I'm guessing that's not universal.
Nope. In many cultures, especially those with a more relaxed, relational way of life, time is much more fluid and flexible. Interruptions, no problem. Delays, it happens. Relationships come first.
So how does this actually play out? Give us a real-world example.
Okay, imagine you're an American executive You're trying to schedule a meeting with a Brazilian team. You send a calendar invite for 10:00 a.m. sharp. You get there at 9:55, ready to go.
Sounds normal to me. What could go wrong?
Well, your Brazilian colleagues might not show up till 10:30
Yeah.
or even later, and they might not even say sorry for the delay. They'll just come in, greet everyone, chat about their weekends, and then get down to business.
Oh, wow. That would be a little jarring if you're used to like that very strict American sense of time.
Totally. But it's not that they're being disrespectful, they just have a different idea of time. In Brazil, relationships and those personal connections are often more important than a rigid schedule. Flexibility is expected.
So how do you handle that? Just accept that meetings will always be late.
Not necessarily. You can set expectations, but also be flexible. If you're from a linear time culture, you might need to be more upfront about your expectations around punctuality and be more patient with your colleagues from those more flexible cultures.
So it's about balance again, structure and flexibility. Are there cultures that are in the middle too? Not totally linear, not totally flexible.
Of course, it's never black and white. Lots of cultures blend the styles. Like in France, they generally value being on time, but they're also more likely to accept interruptions or delays, especially if it's about building relationships.
Okay, this is making me rethink how I use my calendar. Maybe I need to like loosen up a little and be more accepting of different ways of doing things.
Maybe. It's good to be aware of our own biases, and adapt.
All right, we revisited communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. What's our final stop on our cultural tour?
Let's talk about persuasion again. Remember the persuading scale, different ways people construct and present
Oh,
arguments.
yes, persuasion. It's always interesting to me because it's not just about having a strong argument, right? It's about understanding your audience, connecting with them, you know, tailoring your message. And I bet it gets even more complex across cultures.
For sure. Persuasion is a subtle art. It requires a deep understanding of the culture. Remember the difference between application first and principle first.
Yes. Application-first cultures, like the U.S., they start with those specific examples, then build to the main point. Principle first, like France, start with the big picture, then the evidence.
Exactly. How does that play out in the real world, though?
Yeah. Give us a scenario.
Okay, imagine an American executive. They're trying to sell a new software product to a German client. They come in all enthusiastic, showcasing all the cool features, talking about efficiency and user-friendliness.
Sounds like a classic sales pitch. What's the issue?
Well, the German client might not be that impressed. They might be thinking, where's the data? What's the proof that this actually works? How will this fit with our current systems? They need that concrete evidence to be convinced.
So you could think you're giving this amazing presentation, but they're just not buying it because you haven't given them the kind of information they need.
Exactly. It's not that they're being difficult, they just have a different approach. In German culture, they really value thoroughness, precision, attention to detail. They need that evidence to feel good about making a decision.
So do you just like overwhelm them with data then? Lots of statistics.
Well, not necessarily. It's about finding that balance. You show the benefits, and you give them the proof they need to feel comfortable. So you might adjust your presentation a bit, maybe focus more on the technical details. Provide case studies, testimonials from other happy customers, that kind of thing.
Okay, so tailoring your message to the cultural context. This culture map really is a secret weapon. It's like you can understand how different people think, how they made decisions.
Exactly. It's all about those bridges, that understanding, even when we have different ways of approaching things.
Well, we've covered so much in the second part. We went through all 8 scales, looked at real-world scenarios. I'm feeling way more confident about navigating cultural differences now.
That's great to hear. I think the most important thing to remember is that cultural differences, they're not obstacles, they're opportunities. Opportunities for growth and connection. By embracing those differences, we can expand our perspectives, build stronger relationships, and be more successful in our lives, both personal and professional.
I love that. So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep your culture map handy. The world is so diverse, so fascinating. The more we understand each other, the better. We'll be back soon with the final part of our deep dive into the culture map. We'll wrap up the discussion and leave you with some final thoughts, some actionable takeaways. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive.
It's incredible how much we've uncovered about cultural differences with Erin Meyer's culture map. I feel like I've gone through like a cultural boot camp, in the best way possible, of course.
You've definitely earned your stripes. We've been through all 8 scales, and those real-world examples really make a difference, don't they? Absolutely. It's one thing to read about these differences,
Yeah.
but it's totally different to hear how they actually play out in real-life situations. I'm thinking back on so many past interactions, and I'm like, oh, maybe that wasn't personal. Maybe that was just a cultural misunderstanding.
Exactly. That's what's so great about the culture map. It gives you this new lens to see the world through. It helps you understand why people act the way they do. Not to excuse bad behavior or anything, but just to have that extra layer of empathy.
I'm curious, what's been your biggest takeaway from our deep dive? Like, what's really stuck with you?
For me, it's realizing that cultural differences aren't something to be afraid of. They're not something to avoid. They're something to be embraced. They make life richer, more complex, and they challenge us to grow and see things from different perspectives.
I love that. It's so easy to think that our way is the right way, right?
Yeah.
But the truth is, there are so many different ways of seeing and doing things, and they're all valid.
Exactly. That's what makes cross-cultural interactions so interesting and so rewarding. They push us out of our comfort zones and make us question our assumptions about the world.
Speaking of comfort zones, Meyer talks about style switching as a way to navigate those cultural differences. It's kind of like cultural code switching, right?
It is. You adapt your communication style to fit the cultural context. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean you completely change who you are, but you become aware of the norms and you adjust your behavior a little.
So give us some practical tips. How do we actually do this? What should we be thinking about when we're interacting with people from different cultures?
The most important thing is to be observant. Pay attention to how your colleagues communicate, how they make decisions, how they build relationships. Look for those little clues that tell you about their cultural values.
So be a cultural detective.
Exactly. And once you have some clues, you can start adapting. Like if you're working with a team from a high context culture, you might have to be more indirect in your communication. Pay more attention to nonverbal cues.
Right. A nod doesn't always mean yes everywhere.
Exactly. And if it's a more hierarchical culture, you might need to be more careful about your language, your demeanor. Show respect for authority and seniority.
So be sensitive to the context and adjust your behavior. But what if you mess up? What if you accidentally offend someone?
Don't worry too much. We all make mistakes. The key is to learn from them.
So if you realize you've messed up, what's the best way to handle it?
Be sincere in your apology. Acknowledge the mistake, express your regret.
Okay, but is it enough to just say, I'm sorry?
It depends. It depends on the situation, on the culture. Sometimes a simple apology is enough. Other times you might have to explain your actions or even offer to make amends.
So read the room and respond in a way that makes sense for that culture. This whole conversation is really making me rethink cultural sensitivity. It's not just about being politically correct. It's about being genuinely respectful.
I agree. It's about curiosity and a willingness to learn.
I'm curious, what advice would you give to someone who's about to have their first cross-cultural experience? Someone who's maybe a little nervous, a little intimidated.
I'd say embrace the challenge. See it as an opportunity. You can expand your horizons, learn new things, connect with people from all over the world. It's amazing.
That's great advice. Don't be afraid to dive in. Be curious. Be open to learning.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone. Everyone makes mistakes. We all have those awkward moments. It's all part of the process.
This has been such an incredible conversation. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools to use, a whole new way of thinking about cultural differences.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the culture map, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Remember that cultural differences are not walls to separate us, they're bridges to connect us. The more we embrace those differences, the more understanding, the more compassionate, the more connected our world will be.
Beautifully said. Couldn't agree more. So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, keep those culture maps handy. The world is a fascinating place, and the more we understand each other, the richer our lives will be. Until next time, happy deep diving.